Should you use semicolons in your writing? And right now, I am walking on sacred ground. This is like trying to convert someone to a new political belief or religion at Thanksgiving dinner because authors hold their punctuation choices, especially their use of semicolons, so near and dear to their heart, it's almost like a cult. And I'm not going to sit here in this video and advocate that you shouldn't use semicolons, but from what I have noticed, in my own life and while talking to thousands of amateur writers is that many people use semicolons to signal intelligence, to signal that they know what is going on. And Kurt Vonnegut says in his very famous quote, I'm sure you've heard before, that here is a lesson in creative writing. First rule, do not use semicolons. They are transvestite hermaphrodites representing absolutely nothing. All they do is show you've been to college. And obviously, Kurt is a jokester, but we're going to hear from countless other authors on semicolons today. But every single time you hit the semicolon button or write it in, you are choosing to not do 15 other things that actually may be more effective, which include other punctuation marks, conjunctions, and transitional phrases. And when someone hits the button, they don't think about those other 15 options. And my girl Ursula K. Le Guin, says of the semicolon, defending them, the semicolon tells you that there is still some question about the preceding full sentence. Something needs to be added. And something I've noticed is that I think authors sometimes, though, structure their sentences around the semicolon. They view it as a device to enhance the sentence, to create that anticipation for the second half, which is interesting and I think a cool medium to work with, but can get out of control very fast because it's almost subverting, as Vonnegut said, it's a transvestite hermaphrodite, the actual purpose of punctuation marks, which is to control the reader, to control the breath and the pace. And Le Guin again says that I use a lot of half-assed semicolons. There was one of them just now. That was a semicolon after semicolons and another one after now. And that's what's nice about semicolons is that you have the freedom as an author to use them and any other trick or usage in any way you want. And it doesn't matter what anyone says. But I think that something has been lost in our modern world, which is the idea of a serious author, the idea of someone who believes in themselves and their work, and it doesn't need to be self-referential or weird, and it's just a straightforward killer. And the perfect example of this is Cormac McCarthy, who is a staunch advocate against the semicolon. And he said in his Oprah interview, I believe in periods and capitals, in the occasional comma, and that's it. And the only book he used semicolons in was his first book at the behest of his editor at the time. And there were maybe 2 or 3 in there. And when I see them sometimes, I'm like, oh my God. But then across his next 1,000,000+ words, never once did he use a semicolon. And he is considered one of the best prose stylists of all time. And when McCarthy edited other people's books, and he edited dozens of books for people, his number one rule was remove all these semicolons. And what's interesting in terms of our modern writing is that we are in a more flamboyant stage right now because in the Victorian era, there was a dramatic emphasis on everything. If you even go read people's like diaries from back then, it feels like you're reading the craziest adventure tale. But there was an overuse of semicolons because in that time and into the 20th century, people replaced the comma outright with a semicolon for just dramatic emphasis, not just even the idea of connecting these two closely related independent clauses. But then in modernism, and especially a bunch, with many modernist writers, they rejected this idea of the semicolon, most notably Ernest Hemingway, who throughout his work only used a couple. And I know Hemingway is a very polarizing and somewhat random example to bring up because most people don't write like that anymore. Most people aren't interested in reading that type of style anymore. But I think at some level that is a reflection of where we are at as a society right now because we are in this moment. We cannot necessarily see who we are and what we desire. Because when I show people Hemingway or modernist poetry, they don't get it. They want something that's more emotional, that's more flamboyant, that's more infused with purple prose, and they don't understand iceberg writing or writing about objects and many of these other principles because it's rooted in principle. And as a society that's always flashing from one thing to another, we get further and further away from their teachings. And instead, our idols, the people that we look to, many of the people writing today are versifiers. They are trained in MFA programs and have figured out that the path to creating the most dopamine and interaction with readers is not building on modernism like Cormac McCarthy did. And if you look at Cormac McCarthy's career, you could see outside of his break with all the pretty horses that he was not selling any books. But by diluting a lot of the problems of postmodernism, like the length and the ambiguity and some of the radical topics, if you dilute some of that down, but still bring some of that purple prose, but do it in a faux authentic way by saying this is my marginalized voice or this is this authentic story, then suddenly you have the template for many literary fiction books that are being released and pushed today. But what's interesting, speaking of modernism, is that one of the progenitors of postmodernism, James Joyce in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, abandoned the idea of semicolons and many punctuation marks at all to try and actually mimic and depict an actual experience of consciousness. And so the injection of the semicolon is not really authentic. And when I think of authentic writers, I think of someone like Charles Bukowski. And when I look at his work, including his fiction, very few, if no semicolons are ever present. And so I would like to ask you guys right now, why are you using semicolons? Because David Mamet, the famous screenwriter, said that no one ever speaks with a semicolon. So why have we elected this punctuation mark to transcend the actual purpose of punctuation and turn itself into a symbol? And as Vonnegut says, it rings to me that people are trying to impress others, that it's a way to show what's going on, because I also know that many people use semicolons incorrectly, that as an editor of work and as someone who knows editors and who has talked about all this nerdy stuff before, they say that they discourage people to use semicolons or have to change countless semicolons while they are editing because most modern individuals do not know how to use them. And they think because Grammarly tells them to use a semicolon, or they have these two seemingly joined independent clauses, that they need to use one. And just as a quick piece of writing, I guess one could say psychology of the reader, when someone, and this is most of the time, when someone reads a period, they take a full stop. When they read a comma, they take a quarter stop. But when they read a semicolon, they take half a stop. But another punctuation mark, which also creates half a stop, is the M dash. And I am a huge advocate and think that the M dash is heavily underutilized by authors. If you go and read, Cormac McCarthy's only nonfiction essay, The Kukule Problem, or whatever it's called, he uses so many of these because he is trying to control the reader. He is trying to get that half a breath stop. And what's interesting about the M dash is that it doesn't necessarily signal that these two ideas are connected, but it doesn't end the sentence with the period, which says we're kind of moving on to a new topic. And so McCarthy uses his M dashes to extend sentences and ideas that are very complex and nuanced scientifically. And I think it's something he discovered later in his life. And when I look at most of my favorite authors and authors who I respect in 2025, they are not doubling down on semicolons. They are rather doubling down on M dashes and really playing with them and understanding how they work, because they can replace periods, commas, semicolons, and so many other things. And so my solution to the semicolon crisis is to lean into this. And I think when you do, your need to use semicolons is going to start to fade away, especially stylistically, because M dashes sound better, they look better, and they make things flow better. Breaking up the flow just to connect these two little ideas feels like it's Twitter. Feels like you are working with these constraints and like trying to produce something that could just be said or shown. And so, boom, there it is, everybody. Thank you guys for being here. I know that, once again, this is somewhat of a controversial topic, but I don't think you should rid yourself entirely of semicolons, but think consciously of the over 15 things that you could do every single time you use one. And I think you will have a renewed perspective.